The world is changing with really remarkable speed. If you look at the chart at the top here, you'll see that in 2025, these Goldman Sachs projections suggest that the Chinese economy will be almost the same size as the American economy. And if you look at the chart for 2050, it's projected that the Chinese economy will be twice the size of the American economy, and the Indian economy will be almost the same size as the American economy. And we should bear in mind here that these projections were drawn up before the Western financial crisis. A couple of weeks ago, I was looking at the latest projection by BNP Paribas for when China will have a larger economy than the United States. Goldman Sachs projected 2027. The post-crisis projection is 2020. That's just a decade away. China is going to change the world in two fundamental respects. First of all, it's a huge developing country with a population of 1.3 billion people, which has been growing for over 30 years at around 10% a year. And within a decade, it will have the largest economy in the world. Never before, in the modern era, has the largest economy in the world been that of a developing country rather than a developed country. Secondly, for the first time in the modern era, the dominant country in the world, which I think is what China will become, will be not from the West and from very, very different civilizational roots. Now, I know it's a widespread assumption in the West that as countries modernize, they also westernize. This is an illusion. It's an assumption that modernity is a product simply of competition, markets, and technology. It is not. It is also shaped equally by history and culture. China is not like the West, and it will not become like the West. It will remain in very fundamental respects very different. Now, the big question here is obviously, well, how do we make sense of China? How do we try and understand what China is? And the problem we have in the West at the moment, by and large, is that the conventional approach is that we understand it really in Western terms using Western ideas. We can't. Now, I want to offer you 3 building blocks for trying to understand what China is like, just as a beginning. The first is this, that China is not really a nation state. Okay, it's called itself a nation state for the last 100 years. But anyone knows anything about China knows it's a lot older than this. This was what China looked with the victory of the Qin dynasty in 221 BC at the end of the Warring State period, the birth of modern China. And you can see it against the boundaries of modern China. Or immediately afterwards, the Han dynasty, still 2,000 years ago, and you can see already it occupies most of what we now know as Eastern China, which is where the vast majority of Chinese lived then and lived now. Now, what is extraordinary about this is what gives China its sense of being China? What gives the Chinese the sense of what it is to be Chinese comes not from the last 100 years, not from the nation-state period, which is what happened in the West, but from the period, if you like, of the civilization state. I'm thinking here, for example, of customs like ancestral worship, of a very distinctive notion of the state, likewise a very distinctive notion of the family, social relationships like guanxi, Confucian values, and so on. These are all things that come from the period of the civilization state. In other words, China, unlike the Western states and like most countries in the world, is shaped by its sense of civilization, its existence as a civilization state, rather than as a nation state. And there's one other thing to add to this, and that is this. Of course, we know China's big, huge, demographically and geographically, with a population of 1.3 billion people. What we often don't really are aware of is the fact that China is extremely diverse and very pluralistic, and in many ways very decentralized. You can't run a place on this scale simply from Beijing, even though we think this to be the case. It's never been the case. So this is China, a civilization state rather than a nation state. Well, what does it mean? Well, I think it has all sorts of profound implications. I'll give you two quick ones. The first is that the most important political value for the Chinese is unity, is the maintenance of Chinese civilization. 2,000 years ago, Europe broke down the fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire. It divided, and it's remained divided ever since. China, over the same time period, went in exactly the opposite direction, very painfully holding this huge civilization state together. The second is maybe more prosaic, which is Hong Kong. Do you remember the handover of Hong Kong by Britain to China in 1997? You may remember what the Chinese constitutional proposition was. One country, two systems. And I'll lay a wager that barely anyone in the West believed them. Window dressing. When China gets its hands on Hong Kong, that won't be the case. 13 years on, the political and legal system in Hong Kong is as different now as it was in 1997. We were wrong. Why we were wrong? We were wrong because we thought, naturally enough, in nation-state ways. Think of German unification, 1990. What happened? Well, basically the East was swallowed by the West. One nation, one system. That is the nation-state mentality. But you can't run a country like China, a civilization state, on the basis of one civilization, one system. It doesn't work. So actually the response of China to the question of Hong Kong, as it will be to the question of Taiwan, was a natural response. One civilization, many systems. Let me offer you another building block to try and understand China. Maybe not sort of comfortable one. The Chinese have a very, very different conception of race to most other countries. Do you know, of the 1.3 billion Chinese, over 90% of them think they belong to the same race, the Han. Now, this is completely different from the other world's most populous countries. India, the United States, Indonesia, Brazil. All of them are multiracial. The Chinese don't feel like that. China is only multiracial, really, at the margins. So the question is why? Well, the reason, I think, essentially is, again, back to the civilization state. Very, very, a history of at least 2,000 years. A history of conquest, occupation, absorption, assimilation, and so on, led to the process by which, over time, this notion of the Han emerged, of course, nurtured by a growing and very powerful sense of cultural identity. Now, the great advantage of this historical experience has been that without the Han, China could never have held together. The Han identity has been the cement which has held this country together. The great disadvantage of it is that the Han have a very weak conception of cultural difference. They really believe in their own superiority, and they are disrespectful of those who are not. Hence their attitude, for example, to the Uyghurs and to the Tibetans. Or let me give you my third building block, the Chinese state. Now, the relationship between the state and society in China is very different from that in the West. Now, we in the West overwhelmingly seem to think these days, at least, that the authority and legitimacy of the state is a function of democracy. The problem with this proposition is that the Chinese state enjoys more legitimacy and more authority amongst the Chinese than is true with any Western state. And the reason for this is because, well, there are two reasons, I think. And it's obviously got nothing to do with democracy, because in our terms, the Chinese certainly don't have a democracy. But the reason for this is, firstly, because The state in China is given a very special, enjoys a very special significance as the representative, the embodiment, and the guardian of Chinese civilization, of the civilization state. This is as close as China gets to a kind of spiritual role. And the second reason is because, whereas in Europe and North America, the state's power is continuously challenged. I mean, in European tradition, historically against the church, against other sections of the aristocracy, against merchants and so on. For 1,000 years, the power of the Chinese state has not been challenged. It's had no serious rivals. So you can see that the way in which power has been constructed in China is very different from our experience in Western history. The result, by the way, is that the Chinese have a very different view of the state. Whereas we tend to view it as an intruder, a stranger, certainly an organ whose powers need to be limited or defined and constrained, the Chinese don't see the state like that at all. The Chinese view the state as an intimate, not just as an intimate actually, as a member of the family. Not just, in fact, as a member of the family, but as the head of the family, the patriarch of the family. This is the Chinese view of the state. Very, very different to ours. It's embedded in society in a different kind of way to what is the case in the West. And I would suggest to you that actually what we are dealing with here in the Chinese context is a new kind of paradigm, which is different from anything we've had to think about in the past. You know, China believes in the market and the state. I mean, Adam Smith, already writing in the late 18th century, said the Chinese market is larger and more developed and more sophisticated than anything in Europe. And apart from the Mao period, that has remained more or less the case ever since. But this is combined with an extremely strong and ubiquitous state. The state is everywhere in China. I mean, its leading firms, many of them are still publicly owned. Private firms, however large they are, like Lenovo, depend in many ways on state patronage. Targets for the economy and so on are set by the state. And the state, of course, its authority flows into lots of other areas, as we're familiar with something like the one-child policy. Moreover, this is a very old state tradition, a very old tradition of statecraft. I mean, if you want an illustration of this, the Great Wall is one. But this is another. This is the Grand Canal, which was constructed in the first instance in the 5th century BC and was finally completed in the 7th century AD. It went for 1,114 miles, linking Beijing with Hangzhou and Shanghai. So there's a long history of extraordinary state infrastructural projects in China, which I suppose helps us to explain what we see today, which is something like the Three Gorges Dam and many other expressions of state competence within China. So there we have three building blocks for trying to understand the difference that is China. The civilization state, the notion of race, and the nature of the state in its relationship to society. And yet we still insist, by and large, in thinking that we can understand China by simply drawing on Western experience, looking at it through Western eyes, using Western concepts. If you want to know why we unerringly seem to get China wrong, our predictions about what's going to happen to China are incorrect, this is the reason. Unfortunately, I have to say that I think our attitude towards China is that of a kind of little Westerner mentality. You know, it's kind of arrogant. It's arrogant in the sense that we think that we are best and therefore we have the universal measure. And secondly, it's ignorant. We refuse to really address the issue of difference. You know, there's a very, very interesting passage in a book by Paul Cohen, the American historian. And Paul Cohen argues that the West thinks of itself